Hello, and thank you for joining us again for another lecture, this time about urbanization in the late 1800s. Take a look at the image on the screen. What do you see? What do you notice about what you don't see, what you do see? Are there things that maybe don't belong together at the same time? What do you notice? We see a crowded city street. We can see it's in Philadelphia. We see a trolley, an electric trolley. We see horses, a lot of horses, and a lot of people. What does that tell you about this time period? It's kind of in a transition, right? From older to something a little more modern. Cars haven't been invented yet. They're right around the corner. We do have this new transportation with the old transportation. Of course, we see a crowded cityscape, and that's really what this lecture is about. So, during the late 1800s, cities will explode in size, and there are many reasons for that. In early times, factories had to be located near a river, a swiftly flowing river, so that it could turn the water wheel that we've all seen before to power the machinery in the factory. By the time we get to the mid 1800s, however, the steam engine has gotten rid of the need for rivers to power the factory. And instead, factories can be located really wherever it's most convenient for the factory itself. Maybe it's closer to the raw material or closer to a transportation hub. Another reason why cities are growing in size is that Edison's light bulb allows factories to run after dark, and all of a sudden there's a demand for work in factories, not necessarily 24/7, but much longer than before. It was really difficult to work by candlelight in some industries, and especially during the winter when days are short, a lot of production shut down. However, the light bulb allows people, like we said, to work in factories in cities. Agriculture, or the need for workers out west on farms and in the Midwest, had declined because of new farming equipment. And so people that were not necessarily farm owners, but farm workers who worked on other people's farms had to leave because there were simply no jobs because they were no longer needed due to increased manufacturing, at least agricultural manufacturing. And then we'll talk about it more later, but this is a time period of significant immigration to the United States. And we have this stat down there that by 1910, if you look at the 18 largest cities in the United States, recent immigrants made up more than half the population. So it also tells you where the immigrants are settling, right? If they're coming to America for new opportunities and don't have much money, they're not going to have the money to go buy a farm out west or even the ability to get out west to take advantage of the Homestead Act because they don't have any savings. So a lot of them are going to settle in cities, which of course just grow and grow in size. A couple others, the telephone will allow communication advances. We saw in the first picture new transportation intra-city inside of the city itself. We'll soon have subways and electric trains. And then thanks to Andrew Carnegie's steel, we're able to have skyscrapers for the first time. So let's talk about skyscrapers. Now, maybe when we think of a skyscraper today, we might think of something 30, 40 stories tall, something that stretches high into the sky. But the first modern skyscraper was built in 1885 in Chicago at 10 stories. Even if the technology was there to build a strong skeleton to go really high, why wouldn't you necessarily have a 20 or 30-foot skyscraper? Like, what do you need as you walk into the building? If you work on the 20th floor, you're not going to want to take 20 flights of stairs, are you? No, you would much prefer to take the elevator. So the elevator will be something that makes skyscrapers more feasible. They had the ability to build them tall, but no one would have wanted to work there. In fact, early on, the highest floor would have been the least expensive floor because simply no one wanted to go up that high. Today, right, if you're in a skyscraper, you want to be at the very top for the best views. Another innovation that comes to cities is the subway. So Boston has the very first underground subway. People had this idea, right? We have electric trolley cars that are working up top on the city streets. What if we put them underground? That would take a lot of the traffic off the street. And so 1897, we have an image here of the very first subway car in Boston, Massachusetts. We said earlier that immigrants were coming to the United States in large numbers, and this is a map of Chicago, and this is just one specific neighborhood. We've got about 6 blocks north to south, and just 2 blocks east to west. And this is kind of unique. So people who took records, maybe based off of the census, started plotting where people lived. And we know that in large cities, a lot of immigrants settle together in ethnic enclaves. They do this, right, because they're in a new country and they, of course, want to live next to people that speak the same language, that have the same religion, that eat the same foods. And so you get these neighborhoods in Chicago. We see, for example, a large Italian population, the blue, throughout this, but really in these top two city blocks. What else do you notice? Check out all the yellow. What does that tell you? What about that reddish orange color down at the bottom? And then finally, we see green, quite a few Irish immigrants living kind of scattered about, but concentrated in maybe 2 blocks of this. So this really shows this idea of ethnic enclaves for recent immigrants. You also notice the nationality, and some of these nationalities will face increased prejudice that we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Okay, so where do people live in these cities? They're going to live in tenements. Tenement buildings are a particular style of building that was throughout major cities, but really focused on, or will focus on, New York City today. Manhattan's Lower East Side, which today is a very well-off neighborhood with high rents, was an immigrant neighborhood right around the turn of the century. It was also the most densely packed place in the world, with 800 residents per square acre. City life at this time, unfortunately, there were a lot of communicable diseases that would spread. Typhus, cholera, yellow fever were common just because of a lack of sanitation. And of course, there were no vaccinations. They hadn't been invented yet. And so as you cram people into these spaces, diseases will spread very easily. One person who brought attention to the plight of the urban poor was named Jacob Riis, and he went and took photographs of the conditions that he saw, and he published them in a book, but he also kind of gave these lectures where, think of like a slideshow today, where he would project these images onto a wall for people who are middle class or upper class, upper income. And it was entitled How the Other Half Lives, because he wanted the well-off to see how the other half of society was living. These images shocked people and really encouraged them to demand and to work for change that we'll see in a future lecture during the Progressive Era, which is right around the corner. So what is a tenement? If you look at the bottom image today, we see, just count them. You can tell by the different brick how many actual unique buildings there are. They're built right up against each other. And these tenements, when they were first built, were supposed to fix a problem. The problem initially was that if a building was simply rectangular shaped, you would only have windows in the front and the back of the building. A new style called the dumbbell tenement emerged. We can see from the floor plan above how it gets its name. And the idea was that there would be an air shaft between buildings, like we see in the image on the right. Hit pause real quick and take a look at the floor plan and think of how this might solve some problems, but how it might create some other problems. Okay, so you paused. Good. I hope you noticed first off that each floor had four separate apartments. So that public hallway in the middle would often only have one toilet for all four families living on that floor. You can see as you entered an apartment, and they could be divided in different ways. You might have one large bedroom, like on the right side, or you might have two bedrooms on the left. You had a living room and a parlor. You would also have the kitchen crammed somewhere in there as well, usually the parlor because you wanted an exterior window. The idea of the dumbbell tenements, we see that air shaft on the right with the kids standing on top of the building, was to let air flow in. They knew or they felt that circulating air would be beneficial to everybody's good health. However, think about one problem. What's going to accumulate down in that air shaft? It's not easy to get to. It's not easy to clean unless you physically crawl out one of your bedroom windows. Think of all the trash, dead animals, excrement from animals, just everything that would pile up in those air shafts. And so these dumbbell tenements, in some ways, became worse off because, right, stinky, rotted garbage is just festering. What else did you notice about the floor plan? Let's take a look at a few more things. So Jacob Reese, he will draw attention to, like we said, issues of children with no homes. Why would children have no homes? Maybe their parents died. Or maybe during the day, they were, if they were not working, they were out on the streets or they were locked inside of their homes for safety. But in this case, we have unhoused children. Another image of Jacob Reese was of this man. So he's sleeping in the basement of a building. That's the only space he has. When Reese would give these talks, these lectures, he would title them. And so we see in this one, slept in a cellar for 4 years. This is this is his bedroom, right? This is that public hallway at the inside of a tenement. What do you notice here? It's called the baby's playground. Does this look very safe for what? An 18-month-old child to be walking around? It appears we have a water pump above the baby, so people had fresh water. But again, only one toilet, or they would most likely be using an outhouse in the back of the building. So as you see these images, what kind of change would people want? Maybe better health conditions, better sanitation, schools, housing for those who couldn't afford their own rent, safety rails, someone to watch after this child. Today, we still see these tenements, and like I said, the Lower East Side is a very desirable neighborhood. So here's a stat from actually a couple of years ago. This very building that we're looking at, rent $3,000 a month. It's of course a little bit higher today, but it really gives you an idea of some of these buildings are still here. Buildings you may have not wanted to live in 100 years ago are among the most expensive in the United States today. Kind of crazy to think about that, right? Okay, so like we said, there's a demand for help. Who's going to help? We learned earlier that Andrew Carnegie donated a significant amount of his wealth to help those less fortunate. He focused more on education. Other groups will do things like start the YMCA. Churches will add gyms for people's physical health, libraries, health classes, settlement houses we'll hear more about in our progressive era chapter. But these will be kind of community centers that offer education, some child care, some health services to benefit those. And then machine politics. When we watched the lecture and read about politics in the Gilded Age, we talked about the corruption of political machines, right? How they would use these unscrupulous means to gain power and maintain power. However, machines did offer some benefits to new immigrants, right? Someone showed up with nothing, and a machine would say, "Hey, go to this place. They'll get you a place to stay. Go to this place. You can get a job there." So even though we talk about machines as being corrupt, which they certainly were, they did have some advantages, particularly for the urban poor and newer immigrants. All right, one of the coolest things about this time period is called the Great Migration. And the Great Migration was movement of African Americans out of the South up to the North and up to the West during this time period. This image on the screen is by someone named Jacob Lawrence, who was an amazing African American painter. And he painted an entire series called the Great Migration series. And each one had a different title. We'll see a few of those in another place to see what he can really tell us about life, about immigration during that time frame. So, why are they leaving the South? Well, there's racial violence in the South. The number of lynchings in the South was extreme. A lynching is a murder of someone, usually by hanging or maybe being beaten to death. We know that sharecropping did not benefit the farm workers. In fact, it was designed to almost replicate the system of slavery beforehand, where they're kept in debt. And then Jim Crow laws just made life very difficult if you were African American in the South. Now, what's going to bring them to the North and to the West? There's pull factors, things like wages, higher wages in factories. They're not tremendous, as we learned before, but they are more than somebody would make on a farm. The right to vote in northern states was a big draw. To participate in politics was one real reason why African Americans moved north. And just greater personal freedom. There is still prejudice, there is still racism, but there's more personal freedoms. The ability to walk down the street, for example, is something we often take for granted, but that African Americans in the South often did not have. Like we said, there are still issues. There is still racism. Neighborhoods are still segregated. We kind of saw that on the image of the Chicago city block. If you were African American, you were still going to get the lowest wages. And there was a phrase, the last hired, the first fired. So during a business downturn, African American workers would be the first to be let go of. But despite this, there's still this draw, right? This opportunity that existed in the North and the West that was not there in the South that caused them to migrate. Now, another type of migration was immigration from Europe. And in the 1880s, there started to be a shift from where people came in Europe. Before the 1880s, it was places like Germany, Ireland, Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland. But by the last decade and a half, there's a real shift towards Southern and Eastern European immigrants. Those are places like Italy, Russia, Poland, Greece. And even when we say Southern, even Spain was included in that. And there will be, just in this decade, the busiest decade was the aughts, 1900 to 1909, where 9 million people arrived in the United States. So what's going on with them, though? There is a backlash against immigrants. One reason why is because Southern and Eastern Europeans tended to have different religious practices than those who were coming before from Northern and Western Europe. They tended more often than not to be Jewish or to be Catholic Christians, and they'll face a lot of discrimination, just religious discrimination, because of them. These ideas of social Darwinism as well, that we talked about in a previous lecture, they'll be used to discriminate against these newer immigrants that are coming in. And we'll have some laws passed, not until really the 1820s, but they'll limit first to 3% and then 2%, something we'll talk about in the 20s. So things were difficult in cities, but there were also a few new things, some positive trends that were occurring during this time period. And one of them was called the City Beautiful movement. And there was this idea that cities should not just be a maze of streets and brick buildings, but should offer some relief. And so there's this idea of things like museums, of parks, of entertainment venues that really starts to grow during this time period. And we're going to see a couple of those examples. So, what did people do? Well, first, there's this new thing called the amusement park. And we have Coney Island in the US that had the first American roller coaster. Not the first in the world, but the first American roller coaster. These were completely gravity driven, so not quite as extreme as today's roller coasters where you're pulling multiple G's, but if people could, for the first time, participate and use some of this new money that they had. The middle class was growing and people had more income to spend. Movie theaters are becoming a thing during this time period. So we have vaudeville shows with actors, a style of acting, and we also had Nickelodeons. Before Nick was a TV channel for children, a Nickelodeon was a place where you could go and you could see a short film for a nickel. And this is really the time period of the emergence of baseball as the national pastime. So, like we said, there's this desire for cities to become beautiful in some places, and one of the most famous architects in world history was Frederick Law Olmsted. He was a landscape architect, so he didn't really design buildings so much as he designed public spaces, like Central Park in New York. You have this huge rectangle in New York City. If you've ever been there, you know that you can be city streets, wall to wall people crowded, and then you cross the street and boom, you're in Central Park. And you can see with the trees, you wouldn't necessarily even know that you were in a city once you're into the park. This idea is replicated throughout the nation. Other cities say, you know what, we need to have something similar too. If we don't have a big park, we need to plant trees like down the middle of a long street just to bring some greenery, to bring some relief from those problems that existed in urban areas. All right, so as we move on into our next topics, we're going to see, we've already seen some problems. We're beginning to see the solutions that are about to come up. And those solutions will be in our next several chapters. I want to thank you all for watching. This presentation was made by me. All rights are reserved. Take care.